Welcome to our Juneteenth celebration. It's really wonderful to see everybody here and to share a meal with you and a great panel. I want to start out and make sure to give appreciation to the people who are sponsoring this event, the Rackham Graduate School, and I know we have Dean Mike Solomon here with us today. Thank you for your support. The Center for Social Solutions, we have Earl Lewis, who is going to be moderating our panel. Thank you for your support. The Women of Color in the Academy Project. If you're from the Women in Color Academy, raise your hand. Thank you for your support. And our Office of the Vice Provost for Access and Opportunity, and we're going to hear more from Vice Provost Dillard in just a couple minutes. So, and of course, I'm grateful to our panelists, who we are just so fortunate to have an amazing group of panelists here today. I really look forward to what you're going to share. So, Juneteenth is a celebration. It's a celebration honoring emancipation, which should be celebratory, but in some respects, we shouldn't have had to have a day to celebrate this, in fact, right? It's also a solemn day, and it's a reminder that the formal recognition of freedom and the reality of freedom have never really been the same thing. The history of Juneteenth commemorates as much about delay, resistance, and the work of turning our principles into practice as it is about emancipation itself. We know that this was declared a federal holiday in 2021 by then President Joe Biden. It was kind of a coincidence that his wife Jill Biden was actually here on campus this week, and I got a chance to meet with her. So there was some kind of already some reflections going on. And I have to say, it just really pleases me to have an opportunity to have this celebration this year. 2025 was not the same. It was a challenging year, and I have to say, in my office, and I should have started out and introduced myself to those who I haven't met. I'm Lori McCauley, Provost and Executive Vice President for Academic Affairs. I am really fortunate to have teams around me that plan all these events. And I'll have to say last year, because of the state of affairs that I know I don't have to share with you, I realized a couple days before Juneteenth that we had no events. And that just really didn't sit well for me. So at the last minute, we gathered people in the provost's office for lunch, and that was great. But this is much better, and I'm so really pleased that we could be together and celebrate. It's my hope today, with our panel of excellent leaders guiding the conversation, that we can also find good reasons to find a sense of hope and optimism and strength that we can bring from a tradition that matters to so many people. As leaders across higher education and industry are being asked to navigate polarization, scarcity, public mistrust, and organized efforts to narrow the promise of access and opportunity, we know these are not abstract pressures. They're shaping the identities of our institutions and us, really, as human beings. Despite these pressures, I remain deeply hopeful, really, because of being in rooms like this today and all of you that give me hope. It comes from rooms like this. It comes from people who continue to build coalitions, defend institutions, and insist that leadership can still be principled, strategic, and humane. It comes from things like yesterday, where DAS had a celebration for Juneteenth and had a beautiful reception and lunch. It comes from the opening of the Obama Library this week, which then brought us back memories about our President Barack Obama and his wife, Michelle. You know, yesterday when I was at the DAS celebration, we sang the Black National Anthem, Lift Every Voice. And I've always loved that song, but yesterday it just reminded me, you know, that first line, lift every voice. Lift every voice. And I thought that was really impactful to me. And hope also comes to me from leaders like Angela Dillard, who took on the role as an interim vice provost for our access and opportunity over the past year, and has just been an amazing partner and leader in this space. She brings me great hope. She's dedicated herself to ensuring everyone can succeed at our university with great conviction. We are really fortunate to have her leadership, and I am now going to lift her voice to come and move our program forward. Thank you, Angela.
Thank you so much, and happy Juneteenth. Happy Juneteenth, especially from all of us in A&O, the Access and Opportunity community. And a special thanks to my team, especially team members Debbie Willis and Marionette Cano, yeah, thanks. They're around, right? They worked so hard on this event, and I can't tell you how delighted we were to put in the time and effort to gather all of us here. It really, you know, it means more than I can say to us to be able to do this. And I'm deeply honored to stand here as we host the cornerstone event and the culmination of this week's campus-wide Juneteenth programming. This entire week has truly reflected the best of Michigan, our intellectual depth, our willingness to continue to engage with historical reckoning, and our ability to mobilize community fellowship, which has been on display across these past few days, including the Women of Color Task Force's multi-faith prayer breakfast and the Sankofa event yesterday in the Department of Afro-American and African Studies. Among others, it was a really great lineup. As we gather today, we do so at a unique and critical intersection of history, politics, and meaning. Our theme is Leading at 250, Triumphs, Complexities, and the Future of Executive Leadership. As our nation approaches its semi-quincentennial anniversary of the declaring of its independence from British rule, we're reminded that the journey towards true emancipation, equity, and justice has never been linear nor easy. It's been forged by leaders who possess the grit to navigate immense complexity and the vision to build resilient coalitions in the face of deep societal polarization, not only in this moment, but in so many moments in our past. Today, executive leaders across the cultural, philanthropic, academic, and civic sectors are being tested by unprecedented institutional and public pressures. The legacy of Juneteenth challenges us to look closely at these complexities. It asks us how we maintain organizational mission, ground our decisions in core values, and foster independent critical thinking across a fragmented cultural landscape. To guide us through this vital conversation, we have a panel of visionary executives who embody the very essence of strategic and resilient leadership. Full copies of their impressive bios are available at your table for you to read, but it's my privilege to briefly introduce them to you now. First, our moderator, Dr. Earl Lewis, who is the founding director of the Center for Social Solutions and the Thomas C. Holt Distinguished University Professor of History and Afro-American and African Studies here at Michigan. He's also co-founder of the Academic Leadership Initiative, or ALI for short, that seeks to train and support the next generation of diverse leaders at the very top of institutions across higher ed. I'm happy to say that I'm a member of the first cohort of that program, And I have to say, for all of us across the country who've been part of it, we couldn't be more grateful for Earl's leadership and really for his modeling of what executive leadership can look like. We're also joined by Neil A. Barkley, who is the president and CEO of the Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History in Detroit, my hometown, which is one of the world's largest independent institutions dedicated to preserving and celebrating the African American experience. I was joking with Neil that I'm surprised that he's out of the museum today, let alone, and the city, right? So we are really honored to have him here in Ann Arbor and here in Rufin. We're also welcoming Dr. Darian Driver Hudson, a proud University of Michigan alumna, and a visionary president and CEO of United Way for Southeastern Michigan. And finally, Dr. Susan M. Holmes, an accomplished researcher, healthcare consultant, 3-time UM nursing alumna, and a current chair of the University of Michigan Black Alumni Association. So thank you again for being here. Welcome to our panelists. I'm going to get out of the way and let them get on with it. Thanks again.
We are instructed here that when we speak, the button has to be turned on so that our colleagues both in the room and on the various virtual networks and streams can hear us. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Earl Lewis, in case you haven't figured that out yet. And this is an extraordinary moment, and so I won't provide all of the background I'm inclined to. I'm a historian by training, and an American historian at that. And so when we talk about the 250th anniversary of the U.S. And the birthday, it conjures up a whole range of questions and images, both the things that we know and the contradictions that are part of the things that we know. And that's actually brought into sharp focus when we actually juxtapose the pending 250th anniversary and birthday with Juneteenth. If you think about that moment in American history, in June of 1865, June 19th, 1865, and you roll it back just a few months to April of 1865 in Appomattox, and what we think of as the formal end of the Civil War. But then you roll it back even 2 years earlier to January 1st of 1863, and the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation that was to have ended slavery in all of those territories that were under the control of the Confederacy in an armed revolt with the United States. And then you come back to Juneteenth and you go, there are a whole series of contradictions just in those 2 or 3 years. How is it possible that slavery still existed when under one mandate it was to have ended in 1863, under another mandate it was to have ended in April of 1865? But then if you step back a little bit, you also realize that the system of slavery that started with bonded labor in 1619, that extended through 1865, was itself a complicated story. Because oftentimes we tell the story of slavery in the United States as the enslavement of African peoples, those first group who made their way into what became colonial Jamestown. And from there, that bonded labor led to, by 1660s, 1670s, the institution of chattel slavery in Maryland and Virginia that became the model for the rest of the country. But that story leaves out the millions of Native peoples who were also enslaved. And so when we talk even about slavery, how do we begin to actually change the story? Because slavery was the political economy of the United States for 60% of the history of that 250 years or more that we want to celebrate. So if we start the story in 1619 and end it in 1865 and fast forward it to 2026, 60% of American history was defined by the political economy of slavery. Again, we just sort of wrestle with those contradictions. And so at this moment, we thought we actually would come to a panel and talk not just about the past, but about the present and the future, because how we tackle those contradictions requires leadership. It requires leadership in every domain of life. It requires us to be comfortable with what is uncomfortable, to raise questions where sometimes questions aren't to be raised, to insist that we can actually be better than we have been. And that's leadership. And that's one short definition of leadership. So you have before you the long bios of my colleagues, but I'm going to turn to them and turn and just say a little bit about their own journey to leadership by addressing the question, as you think about your own journey to leadership, what specific leadership qualities are non-negotiable? Darian, no, let's start with you.
Wasn't sure. Well, good afternoon, everyone. When I think about my own leadership journey and what's a non-negotiable, I honestly think belief in yourself, whatever self dash is actualization, efficacy, whatever you want to call it, but having that belief that you can do what you are setting out to do, I think, is mission critical. When I was a teacher, I had a principal that kept saying to me, you are going to be an administrator, so I want to teach you how to do these things. You have to lean into that. I think being willing to learn and be a lifelong learner is really critical. You see all of us up here writing today. It's not just because we don't know what to say. We're trying to really absorb what Earl is teaching us and being in this moment. And I think just relentless courage. There is no replacement for that. In the times we find ourselves in, being able to anchor yourself and just being willing to stand. Being in this room today, I'm like, okay, I'm not alone. Even, those moments where you're feeling down, like, nope, I'm not alone. So that for me, I think is really what has led me to this point. And I will also just say, don't run from being resilient and find ways to be resilient. Sometimes it's like, okay, I'm just gonna turn off the TV right now. Sometimes it's going for a walk. Sometimes it's being in spaces like this to be reminded that you can really do anything. My first administrative job, I was 28. Became a superintendent at 36. And I'm not gonna tell you how old I am now, but I've been at it for a while. And I think that don't let anything limit you. The sky is the limit. Anything that you wanna be, you just have to hold on to that through your journey.
What you said. When I think about your comments, though, I particularly think about the fact that courage and resilience are sort of the hallmarks of African American culture, right? It is a thing that has caused us to survive and continue to persevere, even in the face of the adversity that we've experienced now for hundreds of years. For me, the non-negotiables, the first one is patience. This work is not something that resolves itself quickly. Leadership is often not, your goals are not realized in a linear fashion. Things can go backwards, it would seem, and forward. You're not always sure, am I moving in the direction that I'm moving in? I can tell you typically we are. But it takes patience to really realize those long-term ambitions and goals that we have for each other. Particularly in this moment, moral clarity. We see how the lack of that plays out in our politics right now. There seems to be some confusion about what is right and what is not, and what is good and what is not. So having a certain kind of moral clarity has really helped me. Emotional discipline. another aspect that we all need in this work, right? There's so many times that you could just go off about things. I try to do that in the comfort of my own home. But you just can't do that everywhere. You need a certain amount of discipline about how you use emotion. Emotion is very important, by the way, in this work. People have to feel that you care deeply about what you're doing for you to be successful as a leader, I believe. But that emotional discipline is really required. And frankly, also intellectual honesty. How often do we read, I'm also a lawyer by training, don't hold it against me. But how often I find that there's a lack of intellectual honesty, right? People clearly bending things to their own argument or their own persuasion that are not found, in any logical or intellectually honest way of reading what they're working with, right? And so we as leaders have to find our own place of intellectual honesty. What do we really believe is the truth about a certain matter? And then follow that through.
Thank you.
So what both of you said,
Okay.
we'll start with that. And so as you were speaking and as you posed the question, I just think about the non-negotiables of leadership in my pathway. I would say appreciation for the village, the people who have supported me and been around me, my family, some people in this room who I went to undergrad with or worked with at Michigan Medicine with. I think we need to value those relationships that we build over time and invest in relationships before you need them. I think it's very important that we don't just reach out to people when we need them, but check on them. I'm a nurse, as has been stated, and so part of nursing is an art and a science both. So I think my nursing training, my nursing career has helped me to develop some of the leadership qualities that I have. I would also say a commitment to community service. We talked briefly that working with a volunteer organization, which is what the University of Michigan Black Alumni is, has different challenges and different ways to try to engage our alumni base and keep people involved and active. And so that is something definitely that tests your leadership qualities and skills to be able to engage people and get them involved. I would also say emotional intelligence is just as important because you have to know how to speak, when to speak. You don't always have to speak. Learning the value of silence and letting words just kind of sit and marinate before you respond. I attended a leadership conference quite a few years ago, and someone said you should always pause, reflect, and respond. That first immediate response is usually wrong. So if you need to write an email and leave it in draft form forever, then you need to do that. If you just need to sit in it and not respond, then that's something as well. But I'm just honored to be on the panel with these fellow comrades and look forward to the additional conversation.
Thank you all for those first sets of comments. Let me probe a little more. You used the word self, Darian, in talking about leadership. So take me into a moment in your own life where you discover something about yourself that has actually shaped the leader you'll become.
So there are probably a few. So I was in education for almost 20 years prior to coming to United Way. And so my whole education career was Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan. What do they have in common? They are all purple states. And in Wisconsin, it's more like a gingham, if you can imagine that. And so it's not really blended. And we were going through the Republican, the state assembly was largely Republican, and I should say more conservative even. And they were writing legislation around a state takeover. And basically, Milwaukee Public Schools would have been absorbed, by this function. And having to stand to talk about why certain school districts, like Memphis, like Milwaukee, other largely black districts were, going through the state takeover, that seemed to be the only option, was something I had to talk about publicly. I had to know who I was, had to be comfortable in my own skin. I had to know my history to be able to stand and bring diverse coalitions of people around this type of a topic. Had to corral my team to say, we're gonna focus on our student achievement so that we don't even have to be in this situation. And it was easy. What did you say about emotional discipline, wanting to go off and all those things? I said, we can't. And I'd go home and throw stuff and all that, but in that public setting, I had to really just make sure that we were staying focused. And we came out of it. It actually it ended up not happening to us. We were able to stay, solvent and continue to lead. This was 2014, 2018. But it just taught me that, sometimes it's not even about standing up for what's right, but let's stand on the facts, the truth about what is possible for children and families and communities that are struggling. And again, just the village, you talked about that. I had an army of mentors. We'd get on a call at midnight. They were all former superintendents, and they would walk me through it. And so I think it is that self-determination, knowing my history, having other people who would stand with me, but keeping 10,000 employees focused on what mattered, and that was making sure that our children were educated. And so that's something that's really carried me through a lot of different situations.
Let's see. So for me, I've lived and worked in a lot of different places, right? A lot of different kinds of organizations. So my career starts out as an attorney. I then go to the University of Texas in Austin to work with their Performing Arts Center, 7-venue complex on that campus. Go to Pittsburgh to create what became the August Wilson Center. I'm founding director there. To New Orleans, a troubled city, I would say, in many ways, but a place of very different kinds of mix of people, and then here to Detroit. And the through line to all of that for me has been the fact of realizing, having the aha moment that I'm always brought in to find a way of making an institution realize more deeply what they were founded to do. Going all the way back to why they were created, and then trying to figure out how do we build on that initial vision to create something that's resonant in the present day. So it's really interesting to think about each one of those jobs, and they can be completely different from one another, but that's really been the through line. It's that I'm always that person that's asked to do that in an organization, and that has been really the source, I think, of my personal connection to the work that I've done, and it has made it also very enriching for me, because in each of those situations, there's a lot of frustration, but there's also a lot of humility that's required to go into different kinds of communities, find out what they are interested in, what they are about, what the impetus was for these cultural institutions they've created, and how do we make them even more deeply connected to the communities they serve. So I'm not sure that answers your question.
No, it did.
Good enough.
It did. I mean, in a lot of ways, it talks about even as you move, there's a part of you that moves with you.
Correct.
And so that's very helpful. Susan.
As far as the leadership moments?
Yeah, leadership moments, and yeah.
Okay. I would say in my various roles in the healthcare industry and higher education, I often find that leadership finds you. And you don't always have to have the title of director, vice president, executive to be in leadership roles and be identified as a leader. I think actions speak louder than words in your professional environment. And so when people see you committed to advocating for those for health equity and proper health care, I think that just represents qualities that people are looking for. People to advocate for those who can't advocate for themselves or don't realize they're unable to advocate for themselves because they don't have the healthcare literacy or the tools available to even know what they need at any given time. So in my opinion, leadership, it tends to follow you when you have that commitment and that humility we've spoken about, taking advantage of opportunities to exhibit your skills and communicate and share from your past experience to the benefit of others. I think those would be considered the leadership moments for me.
Thank you. And I should have said at the outset, we will create time at the end for questions from the audience. And so as you're listening to the panelists and you're thinking of questions, just hold on to them. We will come to you. Earlier, before we got started, I was chatting with a couple of folks and remarking I'm old enough to remember the bicentennial of the United States in 1976 and know exactly what I was doing and even have photographs, which my family finds humorous because I was working at Busch Gardens in Colonial Williamsburg that summer, dressed as a black German. In a fest house and flipping tables and all. But you sort of think through 1976, right? And it was a few years after Watergate. And there was a national assumption and there were national norms about what it meant to be both in public office and to be part of a series of communities. 50 years later, one may question whether those norms that framed the bicentennial will frame the 250th in the same way. And so if we think back on what's happened in those intervening 5 decades, and we think about this moment, it raises really a set of profound questions about how we encourage dialogue across difference in the United States at this moment, as compared to that moment 50 years ago. And so, Neil, I'm gonna start with you as someone who has overseeing a museum dedicated to the history of folks of African descent in the city of Detroit, which before the National Museum on the Mall was created was the largest museum of this kind anywhere in the world, I would argue. How do you think about this question about how we actually encourage dialogue across difference?
I actually believe that museums are probably among the few remaining, certainly civic spaces where people can encounter complexity without being asked to immediately choose a side, right? Museums by design present certain kinds of concepts and ideas, but typically they're factual, fact-based, but not in a way that is taking a side necessarily on the material. It's for the person who comes to that material to decide how they take it in, what it means for them, the significance of it, right? So, but dialogue across difference and complexity requires, I think, a certain amount of shared commitment to the truth. Are you looking for the truth, or are you looking to have your own ideas reinforced, right? So if you're looking, when you're when you're dealing with complex issues, you have to be ready for people to have an opposing view, and that's fine in that context. And that should be welcome in that context, because the whole idea of it is not to get at the sort of black and white version of a concept or idea, but the complexity of it. And so if there's I wrote if there's a price for admissions, it's you can't be silent or not engaged in these kinds of situations. So with us, we try to create exhibitions and experiences that are historically based, that have resonance in the present, right? So the exhibits that we're creating are such that it's maybe about a historical time or fact, but it has a direct relationship to something that's happening today. So, for example, the next exhibition that we're opening is on the Electoral College. Interesting subject right now, right? But few people know how that came about, why we have that, and why is it that if all these people voted for one person, somebody else is president, right? Understanding that, right? And understanding what the history was behind how that was created, I think is a real aha moment for a lot of folks. But the way it's done is to present how it came about, and then to ask you as you go through the exhibition, well, what do you think about that now? Is that the same way you would have handled that issue now, right? So it's an interesting way that I think we approach our work, but again, it's about not trying to deliver an easy answer, but trying to deliver the complexity of whatever issues that we might put forward to our patrons.
Susan, you sit in several different spaces from an alumni group, which in some categories, I'm not sure it said it at the University of Michigan, but in other settings, people will refer to affinity alumni groups. And so that's an interesting word when I see that. What is affinity? Okay. But also in the healthcare industry and all. How do you think about the nature of difference? And I'll give one little anecdote. So during COVID, my former chief of staff at the Mellon Foundation called me, and her sister was a respiratory technician outside of Atlanta. And this woman was dying. She was white. My assistant, African American, as her sister, and this person didn't want to be touched by this black woman. And so the respiratory technician's sister is like, okay, I can either let her die or I can ignore her wishes. And so then trying to engage her in a conversation at this point where one's own prejudices are overwhelming one's own sense of well-being and how you encounter. So I say that as context as we talk about this. Sometimes we talk about it at a level of abstraction, but here's just a case where it was not abstract. It was a question, do I do my job and ignore what the patient's requesting, even though they are being racist? Or do I actually ignore them because I have to actually help them survive and live, knowing that they're going to still have their beliefs on the other side of that moment? And so those moments of difference, and I actually I think about them. So anyway, I set that up.
We digress.
And you can run with it anywhere you want.
Well, that's quite interesting, and I just want to share a personal story. I grew up in Jackson, Michigan, and my father and my whole family were very much into athletics and very much sports fans, and my younger sister and I are both alumni of the University of Michigan. And I remember my dad telling me, he passed a couple of years ago, but he shared, I never thought in a million years I would have 2 children graduate from the University of Michigan, because I remember when they would only allow 2 black players on the football team, one on offense and one on defense, because they didn't want 2 black players on the field at the same time. And if you know the context, black wasn't the word they used, used to describe the players at that time. So it's very meaningful to be here in this space. And I would say I had a similar experience working at Michigan Medicine, where I had a patient who did not want me as a nurse because I was black. And so the patient asked to speak to my manager, who was a black female. The patient asked to speak to the director of nursing, who was a black female. And the patient asked to speak to the CEO of the hospital, who was a black male. So, and I'm not going to age myself, but this was in the early 90s, when I was a newer nurse, and I felt some type of way, and that's not probably professional terminology to use on this stage, but I was like, well, if he doesn't want me, then maybe, and it wasn't someone on their deathbed, so I'll just preface that. But it really makes you think, how obstinate someone can be with their views, that they would subject themselves to self-harm by not wanting care from someone who is committed and dedicated to saving lives. And then alternately, I still lived in Jackson for quite a long time, and I worked as a home care nurse. And Jackson, if anybody's familiar, has some very rural areas where there's not many brown faces. And so I would have patients all over Jackson County. I went to one particular house one day, and I just had this sense of, oh, wow. But they were very welcoming. The people were very friendly. And so oftentimes we have to check ourselves for our own bias, implicit bias. And so we make assumptions about people without actually giving them the opportunity to present themselves. And so it's a challenge, definitely in healthcare. And those are examples of both extremes, right? Where someone absolutely didn't want to engage, and then someone did without any issues. So I don't know if they answered the question, but it still exists today. But we have to, take the high road, as Michelle Obama says, when they go low, we go high. So yeah, it's a challenge, and I don't think you're ever ready for it until it happens. So it's hard to predict how am I going to respond in this particular situation, but you do your best at that time.
But we also see it in our politics now, don't we? People really operating against their own self-interest in the name of some policy or philosophy that would hurt them deeply, right? We see it all the time. And so I think understanding sometimes that people are not even following their own rationale or logic because of bias is an important thing to understand about kind of where we are as a country, right?
Darian, you want to add anything? Yeah.
Just quickly, I'll go back to something I said earlier about, starting with data. And so in the work that I do at United Way, we're known as sort of bringing the right and the left together to focus on community improvement. And we have a report that comes out every year called the ALICE Report, Asset Limited, Income Constrained, and Employed. And U of M is one of our largest campaigns, by the way. I just want to say thank you to everyone who supports us. But there's this, don't say equity anymore. You can't say DEI anymore. But we lean on that report to be able to explain that of our working families and all of the Michiganders that are drawing income, some that are below the poverty level, some that are struggling, we still have 40% of our folks in southeastern Michigan who are struggling to make ends meet. 60% of Black Michiganders are struggling to make ends meet. 75% of single female households are struggling to make ends meet. And so that's usually a place to start. We know that doesn't always work, but it's just at least to try to find a common language to have conversations across difference. But I think the other side of this, because as soon as you asked that question, I thought about when George Floyd was murdered. And, we were all remote then. And it required a certain vulnerability that I was not used to sharing publicly to talk about my reaction to that. I knew I had a responsibility, as much as it hurt. It's even hard to just to talk about what it's like to be Black in this country, even someone like me. And I knew I had to, in very different spaces, when people said, "How are you doing?" I had to be honest. I couldn't just say, "Well, I'm doing all right." I talked about the fear I have when my husband leaves out the door every day. We both drive Cadillacs. We're a GM family. And, so I start chuckling, right? Because you're just like, oh, here we go. Every time we get pulled over, it's like, okay. So explaining that to someone and being vulnerable with my team, accepting help from people who didn't look like me, who, because it was the kind of reaction that I was almost like, I don't even want to talk to anybody, just leave me alone. But people were like, no, I'm here to help you. It's my job as your employee to support you. We're going to work through this together. And being vulnerable enough to do that, having board members who just didn't even know where to start. But after they heard me just sort of explain what life is like, it just sort of came to me and said, I have a lot to learn. This is more than a workshop. This is more than a training. This is more than a policy, but it's just understanding the human condition. And so trying to lead by example in those really vulnerable moments is definitely the hardest part of my job. I will say that by far. But I do think it's a responsibility that people just have to understand. You said you all were the first, you and your sister went to Michigan. I have 2 degrees from Harvard. People expect, oh, she's, bougie and she's this and that and that. But it's like, let me help you understand. When I was, 43 going on 44 carrying my son in this state, I was concerned every day that we were going to be a statistic because maternal mortality is so much higher for Black women in Michigan than pretty much anywhere in the country. And just trying to make that real, make those numbers real for people, I think is really critical. And the last thing I'll just say is sometimes you really do have to just agree to disagree, and it's okay. You know, the Obama Presidential Center opened yesterday. They extended invitations to certain people and not to others, and they didn't apologize for that. And I think that's okay. So I think that, you know, sometimes we think we've got to get through, and sometimes you just agree to disagree and find that coalition of the willing to keep trying to move the work forward.
Thank you. And being reminded, and I'll tell a little story, and I know this is being live streamed, so this is now going to be a national story. But at another point in my life, when I was president of the Mellon Foundation, I was at an event, small event with the president, former president, in the White House, and he had talked about trying to engage in coalition building across the aisle, and then what had happened in the first term and what was clearly not happening in the second term. And so some part of this is no doubt learning that you can actually try your damnedest to be as inclusive as possible and to not only be snubbed, but to be sabotaged. And that's an interesting question because that will lead into my next question, which is, as we sort of think about this, is how do you build partnerships that are strategic and resilient, particularly in these moments? I mean, this moment that may be one of the most polarized moments in the last century of American history. How do you build partnerships that are strategic and resilient in this moment? And anyone can jump in. All right, Neil, you're up.
Well, you know, I think the thing about partnerships, that word is kind of tossed around a lot, collaborative work and partnerships, and, you know, fundamentally they have to do with trust between two organizations, between two people, between two institutions. And so you really have to first and foremost build a shared value or a common interest between two people or two institutions before you can even get into the notion of what you might be able to do or accomplish together. And a lot of times, you know, I remember the ages when, you know, speaking of grant-making organizations, where they would often give a grant to work within the Black community to a white institution. Right? And the white institution might give you a little bit of that grant, but the majority of the grant was still going to their other work, right, by and large. And it's only been recently that we've been able to articulate if you're going to have a partnership and relationship that both have to have equal power in determining how and what it is that you might want to do together, right? And so, and that fundamentally comes from a shared trust and frankly shared values, right? You have to be coming from the same place in order to do that. And you can't collaborate with everyone. You know, people want you to collaborate with who might seem like the obvious collaborator within your community, and they're not collaborative. They don't want to be collaborative, and you can try to collaborate with them all you want. It's not going to happen, right? So you do need that sort of shared value and that shared sense of what it is that you can and want to do together. That answer your question,
Yeah,
sort of.
no, I appreciate it. Yeah, Darianne.
So I'm a collective impact nerd, if you will. So I really believe in the importance of creating that infrastructure. You know, one of the things United Way is known for is we have a lot of infrastructure. And so I think it's really important to sort of know your role going into a conversation. Sometimes, you know, it is just going to bloom from the interactions that you're having with a different partner, but it's also knowing the strengths of your organization as you're coming to the table and not forcing it down people's throats, but just knowing when, you know, certain questions start coming up or things arise, you just sort of know where to start putting your organization. You don't have to do it all, but this is this one lane that I think we could really excel. So that's one thing that I think about. I think it's really important just to have an open mind towards thought partnership and finding ways to clear your mind, to be able to think. We have a new fabulous mayor, Mary Sheffield in Detroit. She is the first woman in many, many, many years, the only woman in ever. And she's bringing this energy, talking about poverty elimination as a growth strategy. It has everyone buzzing. So who are they calling, right? They're calling all the nonprofits. And I'm getting proposals, people want to meet, and I'm realizing like I have to actually like separate the noise to come into these conversations with an open mind and be able to contribute in a meaningful way. Because a lot of times we're like, okay, we're going to partner. You have no idea what you're even going to partner about. Like that's how they fizzle so quickly if you aren't planful and if you aren't really like locking in to think about what's possible. So I think that's critical. And then the other piece is that communication and finding the tools, the mechanisms to be able to communicate, again, across different agendas perhaps, and make it systemic so that you're able to push the work forward. And I think about some of the collective impact partnerships I've been a part of that have been really successful. Oftentimes they're the ones that are more like response to crisis and short-lived. The ones that are in it for the long haul. If anybody's familiar with the Strive Network and those partnerships that happen with schools, it's a lot tougher. So I think maybe I've said the last thing like 5 times, but I'll say stamina. When you're going into a partnership, and you've talked about patience, Dr. Barkley, it's really important. You're not going to solve the problem overnight. The partnership's not going to click overnight. So just having that patience, but the stamina to stick with it. When you're in year 3 and you're like, oh my God, we've moved the needle 1%. You can't quit if you're committed. And so just really having that stamina and the patience to do it.
Susan.
I would say with the Black alumni and building strategic partnerships, it's very important to acknowledge that the Black alumni is not a monolith. One Black alumni is not one Black alumni is not one Black alumni. And so it's very important to keep that in mind as we reach out to increase engagement and encourage people to stay involved in their campus communities and try to support our current students in this time on campus. And so we actually recently obtained an IHP grant, an Inclusive History Project grant through the university to archive, digitize, and catalog UMBA's history. We turned 50 this year, and so that's a huge accomplishment for us. We're one of the largest affiliate groups, or affinity groups, as they like to call it, of the Alumni Association. And so we're very proud of that accomplishment. And so we have a series of events, and you have to be careful not to exclude anyone, and I'm learning that as well. And you can have the best intentions, but it's very important to just know your audience, know who the key alumni stakeholders are, to make sure you maintain communication so everyone feels that they're involved and included. And I think being a PhD, making data-driven decisions, because if you can provide the facts, this percentage of our alumni base suggested this percentage suggested that. As a qualitative researcher as well, looking at the themes and the feedback we receive, and what are the commonalities between the statements people are offering about how to increase engagement and improve the organization. So that is my take on building partnerships, having the data to support it and understanding who your audience is and how to reach them effectively.
I'm looking, and we're about to transition to the audience to ask some questions, and I know Neil wanted to jump in, but I also want to give everyone 2 sentences to answer one question, and so, but no more than 2 sentences, and so, and the question is really about your wish for the nation on this 250th. If you were to have a wish for this nation on this 250th, what's your wish in a couple of sentences?
I'll go first this time. My wish is for my children and my grandchildren to still have the opportunities that existed for me when I started my path to higher education and professional development, because in some ways it seems like that is dwindling away. And so that is a selfish hope for me, but that is my hope, that my future generations have those same opportunities that I was afforded.
Thank you.
I I guess my hope is that we can move beyond the idea that a love of country requires a selective memory, that it requires that you eliminate certain things about the history of a country or of a nation in order to love it and to still want to be a part of its ideals. That one can honor sacrifice, it can still confront injustice and still believe that there's an opportunity to repair and do better.
So for me, I think about the times when I'm sorry, you said 2 cents, I'm trying, okay. So I want our country and the people in our country to feel hope and a sense of unity, not because there's war or national tragedy or a natural disaster, but because we can believe in our leaders, that there's genuine optimism and belief that this experiment was actually for all of us. And it was such a reminder with yesterday. That's all I have to say. And just that was the moment that I really did feel the most proud. And I see my son, I remember the first time he looked at the Obama poster that I have, it's like half my wall in my office, and he just froze. He could barely walk, but he just froze for the longest time. But what was on the poster said hope. And he just looked at President Obama, and I could tell he was like, that's gonna be me. And I just want everyone in our country to be able to have leaders they can believe in 250 years from now, and know that we can actually accomplish something great.
Thank you all. Let's open it up. I think Debbie and Doreen have mics, and Angela is already jumping at her place.
That wasn't planted.
Yeah, I kind of came with my question, so I've been ready and waiting. And it's a question about something I've been sensing, but can't quite fully wrap my mind around. So Brandon Terry, who's a great historian, has a recent book on the civil rights movement. And the book is really about abandoning the heroic narrative of the movement, because he says it's too simple. Right, so you can't have that and have a really complex history, and he says instead that we should embrace a tragic vision of the civil rights movement, which can be a bit tough to think about. And I wonder if this resonates with you all, and what it might mean to think with a tragic vision as a component of leadership in this moment, and as a way of just introducing more complexity into the practice, into the decision-making, into how you lead. And I kind of think that this is, in some ways, what the study of African-American history can do for all of us. And so I just wonder if you have any thoughts about that. Thanks.
So one of the things that Earl and I have in common is that we were actually born in the same hospital in Norfolk, Virginia. It was one of the last black hospitals in Virginia.
Decades apart.
Yeah, but we were, I wasn't gonna say that part. But my father was an administrator at that hospital, and I remember when the hospital eventually had to close. And one of the things that he would always say to me is that one of the things we missed with the civil rights movement is because we were so focused on the separate, we forgot about the equal. The decimation of black neighborhoods, black community, as we started to integrate. My maternal grandmother was a teacher in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and how they started to integrate, they basically just started picking what would be considered the best black teachers and putting them in white schools. My cousins, if they tested at a certain level, they were bused, across town. And so instead of pouring into the neighborhoods where you had all, the doctors, the lawyers, the mechanical workers, the janitors, teachers, everyone was in the same neighborhood. Now everyone started moving away, and that strong foundation just started to erode. So for me, I think about that all the time. When I go back home, when I go to visit family, and it's like, my parents live in Jackson, Mississippi now. They've been there for about 30 years, and, the little church is barely hanging on, right? The neighborhood's just torn up. And I think about what it was like when I first got there, and then I hear the stories about what it was like even 30 years before that. And that to me is somewhat of the tragic vision, is just what happened to our communities as this country attempted to integrate.
I was thinking, I'm not sure if characterizing as tragic is the most useful. In other words, there is certainly a very difficult, challenging vision, history of African Americans in this country. But is it tragic, right? Is it not something that tells us something about ourselves that is really the reason that we have persevered and will continue to do so? Like in this moment, you know, where all kinds of things are being thrown at the Black community, for example, what we know is that we've survived that before, that we are a resilient people, that we are, you know, creative, resourceful. And so, you know, people talk to me a lot about, you know, well, what do you think about now there's not DEI? I said, well, you know, we had values, we had our mission, we had the way of working before somebody put it in a DEI construct, right? So nothing really changes for us because we're going to stop calling it that, right? It is still intrinsic to the values that we hold as people and as an institution. So I think for me and for the work that we certainly do, the idea is really to make sure that people understand that these things happen because they give a certain context to people who believe a rosier version, perhaps, of history, and they get at how it is that we might have, we might, of the divisiveness that we experience. I explain it like, it's almost like people lived in two different worlds simultaneously. Right? And the fact that they never really crossed in ways is the reason why there's so much misunderstanding about each other in this moment. And so I think things more taking that history, lifting it up, and understanding what it means about who we are now is a more useful construct for us to think about.
And I'll just share briefly, working with the alumni population in Tragic Vision, as you stated, a lot of people have painful memories from their time on campus in Ann Arbor. I remember during my PhD program, I had submitted a paper, and one of my professors said, "Have you ever been evaluated for a learning disability?" And I said, okay, I'm 40 years old, I have 2 degrees from the University of Michigan, and now, you know, in my 40s, I have a learning disability that no one's identified in all the years that I've been in school and different programs. And so even I have painful memories, but that does not keep me from wanting to make the campus experience better for our current students and for the commitment to increasing our numbers on campus. And I believe that learning from those painful memories and using that as fuel to not want that to happen to another student is very important. So the goal of pushing campus engagement with our individual schools and departments and increasing more engagement opportunities with our current students are both, in my opinion, pathways to prevent some of those continued tragic visions from happening.
Probably have time for one more question. So if there's one, yeah, there. Maybe we'll take 2 questions and try to answer them in a combined way.
Okay, my question is, how do you teach your kids that this is happening? My background, I'm Hispanic. So how do you teach your kids this is happening, but at the same time, teach them not to think that everybody's against them? Because it's happening in schools too. My youngest one is 13. So how do you teach them that?
Okay. Let's take one more question, and there was, okay. All right.
This is okay, so I have a question about the examples that Earl and Susan gave about interacting with healthcare workers. And the focus was on not being touched by a Black person, I think was where you guys were going with that. Yeah. And I find that interesting because during enslavement, there was much more intimate contact between Black and white people. Slaves bathed Black people, they turned down their beds, they cooked their food. Yep. So this We fast forward to the 20th century, and now the stereotype about Black people being dirty has gained traction. So I find that interesting and wonder what you think about it. But also, I'm wondering if this isn't really as much about touch as it is about competence. I don't want to be treated by a Black healthcare worker because they don't really know what they're doing. They're not as smart as the Black healthcare workers. And we might even extend that to those of us in this room who are professors. I don't want to be taught by a Black professor because they don't know what they're doing and they're not competent. And Michelle Obama alluded to this yesterday when she said, Obama, US Senator, con law professor, but still many people don't see him as qualified to be president. Yeah. So you guys haven't really talked about competence as an issue in leadership, but I'm wondering what you think about that.
Wonderful questions. And so, one, how do we instill in our children a sense that what they see is real? Or I used to jokingly say, not every paranoid Black person is crazy. But at the same time, help them to function in society. But also this idea of competence and all. So, anyone want to jump in as we make our way, and I understand we're live streamed, so we have a clock that we're working against.
I would say,
which is say 4 minutes.
thank you for asking that question with the healthcare reference. And I agree, it definitely was more of a qualification or competence issue. I think that when professional Blacks are in certain positions, that the perception is that you're not qualified or you're not competent, then that's when the question comes to be. It's not about life or death, it's about, as you stated, are you qualified to be in this position? And in most cases, we're overly qualified. And in that situation I spoke about, I had my master's degree working at the bedside and had been a nurse for probably 10 or 12 years when that occurred. So I definitely agree with you. It is more of a qualification. Who are you to think that you can be in this role? You're taking a job from someone else who obviously doesn't look like you. So thank you for bringing that up. And I think for our children, I have 3 grandsons, and so I think it's being present with them. I think it's being honest and on their level when they have questions, because oftentimes we can put fear in our kids is not necessary. They may ask a question, and then because of our past and our experiences, we may go not overboard, but it's our experience, right? But I think just making sure they're exposed to diverse people from all backgrounds, give them opportunities to interact with people from all backgrounds. My parents weren't college graduates, but we took road trips, we stopped at universities. They instilled the value of education to all of us, that was something no one could take away from you. And so I think just having those principles of opening their eyes to the good people, brown, Black, white, whatever, and making sure they're surrounded and they have that village of support from people that look like them and people that don't look like them.
Probably not the best person to talk about what to tell your kids, so I'm going to skip that question. Although I would agree with what was just said. I don't have any children. But in terms of competency, I think that the thing to be really mindful of is it's almost always an attempt to undermine your authority in a certain situation. And so you really have to feel that competency yourself and know that you are competent, because there will always be people that question that. And if you have the knowledge, the degrees, the experience, that's just hot air, My mother likes to say, people performing badly in your presence, right? It has nothing to do with you. It has what they are bringing to the space. It doesn't have to do with your competency at all. But that's something that you do have to hold for yourself in these situations.
So I would say, so my son is 3.5, and he's in a very diverse daycare. We try to, flood him with diverse materials, different shows and things of that nature. But when I really think about your question, so we got pulled over by the police going to Easter Sunday service maybe like 2 years ago, and Bryson, we sing in the car, we're going to town on Elmo and whatever else, and it just got really quiet. And even he was only 18 months old, he just got really quiet. And it's like he knew something was wrong. He was picking it up from us that something was wrong. And everything was fine. We didn't have to get out of the car. It was nothing like that. But I remember when we pulled off, we all just looked at each other. And my sister was with us too. And it was like, we cannot put on him the burden that we're carrying. We have to try to do everything we can to, it's not shielding him or protecting him, but can he turn 5 before we have to, start having those conversations? Because it's on my mind constantly that we are going to have the talk with him. And it's like he just he's picking that up. We went to a elementary fair, and there was a fireman and there was a police officer. Fire truck, he ran up on the fire truck, all the things. Police officer, he didn't want the sticker, he didn't want anything. And I was like, oh my God, this is becoming, a pattern. How do we break this? So I think, some of it is also trying to be more self-aware of my actions because the children are watching, and trying to give them a fair shot to make their own opinions before they just, adopt what we are feeling, I think is really important. And the last thing with competence, I think, actions, you said it, actions speaking louder than words and demonstrating your ability through what you're able to accomplish are just mission critical. Being, always the first, fill it in, Black woman, female period, or the youngest. I always have to lead with what I can accomplish because people are always trying to undermine you. They're always going to overly question everything you do. And the times when I find that it gets the toughest is actually when you have to talk about compensation. So, even if people are like, okay, we're used to Black leadership, okay, we're used to, women, okay. But when you have to start advocating for yourself for compensation, that's when you start to see the bias. Oh, you don't have enough experience. Oh, it's really not appropriate for you to be advocating like this. You have to let the board determine your salary. And I'm seeing that happen with other female leaders. And I'm just thinking to myself, I have to disrupt this as a board member. I have to find a way to bring this to people's attention. So I just wanted to lift that. Sorry not to end on a high note. Sorry, Aaron.
Nope. Learning, teaching, competence, leadership. I mean, we are at leading at 250. Triumphs, complexities, and the future of executive leadership. And so thank you all for being part of today's conversation and Juneteenth celebration. Thank you to those who have been watching online, live stream. And thank you to the panelists for sharing your experience, your insights, and your wisdom, and yourselves with us here today. And then to the organizers and to all who made this event possible, thank you. And with that, see you next year.